I found out my husband was cheating on me on the exact day my father died, but the woman he chose was not some stranger. It was my own sister. I was standing in a hospital hallway, my hands still shaking from signing the death papers, when the two of them stepped out of the elevator holding hands, not even trying to hide it. My sister looked me straight in the eye and said, "You have nothing left now. No husband, no company, not even any inheritance rights." But what she didn't know was this: the one who was about to lose everything had never been me. My name is Vivian Hale. I'm 32 years old, the eldest daughter of the Hale family, the family behind a logistics empire spread across California. I grew up surrounded by closed-door meetings, thick contracts, and the weight of my father's expectations. His name was Leonard Hale. At 25, I walked away from the family business to build a career on my own because I believed I could stand on my own 2 feet without living in his shadow. I married Adrian Cross, a man who was intelligent, ambitious, and spoke as if he always held the advantage. I used to believe we were a team, that our marriage was strong enough to survive any pressure. My younger sister, Sienna Hale, was 3 years younger than I was, and she had always grown up under the invisible burden of being compared to me. I knew that hurt her. What I never imagined was that that hurt would harden into a cold kind of ambition. When my father died suddenly, I thought the greatest loss was him. But within 48 hours, I realized I had underestimated what was really happening, because what waited ahead was not just a funeral. It was a family chess game, one where I was being pushed off the board, or at least that was what they wanted me to believe. I got the call at 2 in the morning. My phone lit up with Sienna's name. Her voice was strangely calm when she said our father had collapsed and was being rushed to the hospital. I sat straight up in bed, my heart pounding so hard my ears rang, and everything around me seemed to slow down. I threw on a coat, grabbed my keys, and ran out of the house before I had even fully processed what she had said. On the freeway, headlights stretched into streaks of light, and all I really remember is how tightly I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles started aching. I kept wondering why Sienna was the one calling me, and why Adrian had not contacted me first. That thought stayed with me the entire drive, creating a discomfort I could not quite name. When I got to the hospital, Adrian was already there, leaning against the wall, his shirt still crisp, as if he had been prepared for this. He looked at me, gave the slightest nod, and said my father was still in the ICU. His voice was so even it made my skin go cold. I walked toward him, trying to read his face, but all I found was a strange emptiness. Sienna stood a few steps away, her arms crossed, her expression so calm it was almost emotionless, and that unsettled me even more than the bad news. I stepped into the ICU hallway. The smell of disinfectant was sharp, the machines hummed steadily, and I could feel in my bones that I was standing at the edge of something much bigger than fear. In that moment, I still believed the worst thing that could happen was losing my father, and that everything else would somehow settle afterward. I had no idea that the silence between Adrian and Sienna was the truly terrifying thing, and that the call in the middle of the night was only the beginning of a chain of truths I was nowhere near ready to face. I stood outside the ICU, my eyes fixed on the thick glass where my father lay motionless among the machines keeping their steady rhythm. Adrian stood beside me, but the distance between us no longer felt like a few feet. It felt like something much harder to define. I noticed he never looked at my father for very long. His eyes always slid away, as if he were avoiding something. Sienna stepped closer and lowered her voice, asking what the doctor had said. I answered that they were still monitoring our father's condition, but even to my own ears, my voice sounded uncertain. I turned and looked at both of them, and for the first time I felt, with absolute clarity, that something was wrong. When the doctor came out with an update, the 3 of us stood there in silence, but it was not the same silence. I saw Adrian nod before the doctor had even finished speaking, as if he had already prepared himself. Sienna did not ask a single follow-up question. She just stood there with that unnervingly composed expression, and it made my blood run cold. I tried to force a logical explanation over what I was seeing, but every possibility felt thin and false. I stepped down the hallway and took a deep breath. Then, by chance, I heard Sienna's voice somewhere beyond the corner. I could not see clearly, but I recognized Adrian answering her, quickly and in a low voice, in the tone people use when they do not want to be overheard. I stood perfectly still for a few seconds, my heart pounding harder. Then I turned back as if I had heard nothing at all. When I returned to the waiting area, they were already standing apart, each in a different place, as if they had never been close at all. I sat down across from them and kept my face calm, but inside, everything had already started to crack. I realized I was sitting in front of the two people I had trusted most, and both of them were hiding the same secret. What frightened me most was not what I had seen. It was the fact that they had been doing this while my father was lying between life and death, and that told me everything I needed to know about who they really were. I started noticing the stretches of time when Adrian disappeared from the waiting area without ever really explaining where he was going. At first, I told myself he needed space to process what was happening, but it happened too often for me to keep pretending it meant nothing. Every time his phone buzzed, he would glance at the screen, stand up, murmur a short sentence, and walk toward the empty part of the corridor. I stayed where I was, watching him go, trying to convince myself I was only overthinking because of how fragile the moment was. But that uneasy feeling stayed with me, clear and persistent. Then, during one of those moments, after Adrian had just stepped away, I saw that he had left his phone on the chair. The screen lit up with a missed call, and the name on it was Sienna. I froze for a few seconds, trying to come up with some harmless explanation, but the timing of the call would not let me. I remembered every time he had told me he was speaking to a client or a lawyer, and suddenly all of it felt contradictory. When Adrian came back, he grabbed his phone faster than usual, as if he were afraid I had already seen something. I did not ask anything right away, but I held my gaze on him longer than normal, trying to read what he was hiding. He avoided my eyes and shifted the conversation back to my father's condition, but the way he said it made him sound like someone acting a role. Later that night, while I sat alone in the waiting area, I opened my own phone and checked the call history we used to share. I remembered the late-night calls he had explained away as work, but now I was beginning to question all of them. I still did not have hard proof, but the small details were starting to fit together into a picture that made it difficult to breathe. I asked myself whether I was letting grief push me too far, but my instincts had never betrayed me like this. And for the first time, I understood that the problem was not only what I was seeing, it was everything being deliberately hidden in plain sight. I did not confront them right away, even though my mind was already full of questions with no answers. Instead, I began observing more carefully, as if instinct itself was forcing me to slow down and really see everything before I acted. That evening, I told Adrian I needed to go down to the parking garage to get some papers from the car. But really, I only wanted to leave the waiting area long enough to think more clearly. When the elevator doors opened, the lower level was almost empty, lit only by the yellow cast of overhead lights falling over cold concrete. I slowed my steps, then stopped completely when I saw two people standing in the distance near Pillar C7. I did not need to get any closer to know who they were. Adrian stood with his back to me. Sienna stood facing him, close enough that the space between them no longer looked like ordinary intimacy. I stayed perfectly still, half hidden behind a parked car, feeling my heart slam against my ribs. I watched Sienna reach out and touch his arm, lightly, but with the familiarity of someone who had done it many times before. Adrian did not pull away. He leaned slightly toward her and said something I could not hear, but the way they looked at one another made every theory I had been trying to resist suddenly become clear. I did not step out. I did not call their names. I knew that moment did not need any further confirmation. Some part of me still wanted to believe there had to be an explanation, but another part of me already understood that the truth is often much simpler and much crueler than we want it to be. I turned and walked away before either of them realized I had seen them, moving faster with every step as the tightness in my throat grew worse. When I got back to the waiting area, they were there before me, standing apart like strangers, not even looking at each other. Adrian looked at me and asked where I had gone. his voice so normal it made my blood run cold. Sienna sat down and started scrolling through her phone as if nothing had happened. I sat across from them and kept my face calm, but inside, everything had already started splitting open. I understood then that I was no longer standing between a husband and a sister. I was standing between two people who had chosen the same secret. And what chilled me most was not the betrayal itself, but the fact that they had been able to do it while my father was hanging between life and death. That said more about who they were than anything else ever could. I thought I had reached the bottom the moment they silently admitted the affair, but I had underestimated how far they were willing to go. Sienna looked at me for a few moments, as if deciding how much she wanted to say, then smiled faintly, in that coldly composed way that made my skin crawl. She said the thing between her and Adrian was only one part of it, and that if I thought that was the whole story, then I still understood nothing. I stood there and let her keep talking. Adrian turned his face away for a second, but he did not stop her, and that told me he was fully aligned with whatever she was about to say. Sienna spoke slowly and clearly, with the voice of someone laying out a plan that had been carefully prepared. She told me that after our father's death, the company would not remain the way it had been, and that she would be the one taking control of it. I stared at her, looking for some sign of exaggeration, but her expression stayed deadly serious. I asked her, more quietly this time, what exactly gave her the right to say that. She mentioned conversations she had been having with our father recently. She said he had trusted her with most of the control, and that Adrian would be the one helping to run things. A wave of cold ran up my spine, not because I believed her instantly, but because of the way she said it, as though all of this had already been decided long before I knew anything was happening. Adrian spoke then, finally. He said I had chosen to leave the company years ago, and that decision meant I had already removed myself from everything that was happening now. I listened to every word and understood, in that moment, how they were building a version of events in which I had become the outsider. I tried to remember the last real conversations I had with my father, searching for any sign that he had made a decision like that, but everything still felt blurred. Sienna took one step closer, close enough that I could see every expression flickering across her face. She told me I should prepare myself for the formal announcement that was coming, that everything would soon be made official, and that it would be better for me to accept reality now. I did not answer right away. I just stood there and let her words settle. And in that moment, I realized I was not only being betrayed in my marriage, I was being pushed out of my own family and out of the legacy I had always believed I still belonged to. The family meeting took place the next morning in a private conference room inside the hospital, a quiet, sealed-off space that felt so heavy it might as well have been a courtroom without a judge. I arrived a few minutes early and took my usual seat on the left side of the long table, the same place I used to sit when I still had a role in decisions involving the company. When Sienna came in with Adrian, they walked straight to the head of the table, the position that had always belonged to my father. No one told them to, but they behaved as though that place had already been assigned to them. I watched Sienna set down her bag, adjust her chair, and move with the kind of confidence that only comes from rehearsal. Adrian sat beside her, his back straight, his eyes scanning the room like someone already measuring it. When his gaze landed on me, it stayed there for only a second before moving away. The family attorney, Margaret Voss, entered last. She carried a thick file and the same composed expression she had always worn. She greeted all of us, but her eyes stayed on me half a second longer than on anyone else, as though she was weighing something. The meeting began with procedural language, but I could feel from the beginning that the real purpose lay somewhere underneath it. Sienna took the lead immediately, speaking about the need to stabilize the company after my father's death. Her voice was firm, her tone completely unshaken. I listened to every word and recognized the confidence of someone who had prepared this in advance, not someone still reeling from loss. When I tried to ask a question about the actual plan, she answered briefly, then shifted her attention to Margaret as if she expected formal confirmation to follow. Margaret opened the file but did not start reading right away, and that hesitation caught my attention. In that moment, I understood I was already being pushed out of the center of the discussion, even though this was still my family and the company I had once helped shape. Adrian added a few comments of his own about operations, talking about the need for strong leadership in a time like this, and the way he spoke made it clear he was already placing himself in that role. I stayed quiet and listened, but a sharp awareness began to form inside me. Everything in this room had been arranged before I ever walked in. I left the conference room feeling as if I had just walked out of a performance where everyone else had been given the script except me. The hallway outside was silent, but in my head, every sentence Sienna and Adrian had spoken kept replaying over and over. Instead of going straight home, I stopped by the wide windows facing the parking structure and looked down at the rows of cars below, at a world that still seemed to be moving normally. I tried to thread together everything that had happened over the last few days. The call in the middle of the night, the secret glances, the way they had carried themselves in that room, and as I did, an old memory of my father pushed its way back to the surface. I remembered him asking me once, casually, on an ordinary evening, whether I truly trusted the people around me. At the time, I had laughed and assumed he meant business associates, not family. But now I remembered the look in his eyes after I answered, the way he had watched me as though waiting for me to understand something I had not yet seen. I remembered other moments, too. The times he had asked indirect questions about Adrian, the strange tone he sometimes used when mentioning Sienna. Back then I had filed it all away as ordinary concern. Now, standing there in that hallway, I started to wonder whether he had seen far more than he had ever said aloud. I walked back toward the closed conference room doors and stood there for a few seconds. I realized that I had ignored too many warning signs simply because I had wanted to believe family was the last place betrayal could take root. And for the first time, the question shifted. It was no longer why Sienna and Adrian were doing this. It was why my father had chosen not to stop them in a more direct way. Instead of going home to my apartment after that meeting, I drove to the old office tower where I had worked years earlier, back before I left the family company. I sat in my car for a long time, staring up at the building, trying to find some trace of the clarity I used to feel when I was still part of that world. Finally, I went inside, using an old access badge I still carried, even though I was not sure it would work. When the door opened, I realized I still had entry to certain parts of the building, and that detail alone told me something. I headed straight for the financial records room, where I still remembered the filing systems, the categories, the internal logic behind how everything had always been tracked. I turned on one of the machines and opened the latest reports I could access. Then I started reviewing them methodically. At first glance, everything looked normal. The numbers were orderly. The reports were polished. Nothing on the surface suggested anything was wrong. But the deeper I went, the more tiny inconsistencies began to emerge. Funds were being moved in ways that did not fully align with the stated purpose of the transactions. Smaller transfers were being broken apart and routed through different channels. I began recording every irregularity, every transaction that made my instincts catch. The more I dug, the more obvious it became that these were not random errors. There was a pattern, a repeating structure, a deliberate way of splitting larger flows of money into smaller movements so they would be harder to trace at a glance. Then I started checking the approval signatures attached to the documents, and Adrian's name appeared far more often than I expected. What stopped me was not only that he was involved, it was when those approvals had happened. Many of them dated back to the years when I was still at the company, back when I still believed everything was operating under the right hands. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen, trying to fit these discoveries into what had unfolded over the last few days. This was no longer just a private betrayal. It was larger than that, more organized, more carefully hidden. I copied everything I needed onto a separate drive, making sure I had a secure duplicate before anyone else had a chance to notice. When I walked back out into the city, it was already dark. The skyline still glowed like nothing had changed. But to me, nothing was the same anymore. I understood then that I had stepped into a game with rules no one had bothered to explain. And if I did not take control of the truth, they would erase me from the story before I even realized how far it had gone. I did not stop with what I found inside the company systems because something in me knew the picture was still incomplete. The next morning, I reached out to someone I trusted, a financial analyst I had worked with in the past, someone who would know how to read what other people overlook. I did not tell him the whole story. I simply handed him the files I had gathered and asked for a neutral assessment. We met in a quiet cafe, and I watched his expression change after only a few minutes with the data. He did not give me his conclusion right away. Instead, he began tracing each path of money, building out a map on the screen that I had not fully seen until that moment. I sat across from him and followed every move, knowing I was getting closer to a truth I might not want. After nearly an hour, he turned the screen toward me and pointed to a chain of transfers routed into an offshore account. The account holder's name was Adrian Cross. I was not surprised to see his name, but what made me stop was the line beneath it, the one listing an authorized co-controller, Sienna Hale. I stared at it longer than necessary, just to be certain I was not misreading it. He explained that the structure allowed both of them to move funds without going through the company's official channels, and the way they had layered the transactions made them difficult to detect without deliberate analysis. I asked him whether these movements could be traced if needed, and he told me that everything leaves a trail. You just need the right person willing to follow it. By the time I left the cafe, the copied files were in my bag, and I knew this had gone far beyond an affair or a private betrayal. This was a system, planned, deliberate, hidden in layers. But I also understood something else. If they had put this much effort into building it, then they had also created weaknesses they could not yet see. For the first time since everything began, I no longer felt cornered. I could see another path opening, one where the truth itself might become the strongest advantage I had. I did not go back to the hospital or the office after leaving the cafe. Instead, I drove straight to a place I had not visited in years. Margaret Voss's office was in an older stone building downtown, the kind of place where everything about the architecture spoke of discretion and control. I stood outside her door for a few seconds, took a deep breath, and stepped inside because I knew this conversation might change how I understood everything. The receptionist recognized my name immediately and led me into a small conference room where Margaret was already waiting, as though she had expected me to come. She did not seem surprised. She simply motioned for me to sit and placed a glass of water in front of me that I never touched. I started by telling her that I needed to understand what was really happening, but she did not answer me right away. She studied me for a moment with the same sharp, restrained expression she had always worn, as though deciding whether I was finally ready to hear what had been left unsaid. Then she asked me something that caught me off guard. She asked whether I truly believed I had been pushed out of everything. I did not answer immediately, because the question went straight to the thing I had been slowly suspecting since I walked out of that family meeting. I told her that every visible sign pointed in that direction, from the way Sienna was behaving to the financial footprint Adrian was leaving behind. Margaret gave the slightest nod, but she did not agree or disagree. She opened a file she had already prepared, flipped through several pages, and stopped at a document I had never seen before. I recognized it as part of the estate paperwork, but it did not resemble the will in the way I expected. Margaret explained, in that measured tone of hers, that some things are not always arranged in the most obvious way, especially when the person writing them has reason to protect something beyond the surface. I listened carefully, already sensing I was getting closer to a layer of the story Sienna and Adrian had never touched. I asked Margaret why she was showing me any of this now, and she answered that my father never made a decision without a reason, and that if I wanted to understand him, I would have to begin seeing things the way he had. When I left her office, I was carrying more questions than answers, but for the first time since this began, I no longer felt like I was standing outside the game. Margaret did not hand me the whole truth all at once. She let me read what was in front of me and draw my own conclusions. I pulled the file closer and went through it line by line, paying attention to every word. It was my father's official will, formally drafted and carefully structured, every clause clean and precise. I read slowly, and the further I went, the more I understood why Sienna had seemed so confident. Her name appeared in the central position, designated as the heir to the majority of the controlling shares and the operational authority over the company. Attached provisions reference the need for strong executive direction, and Adrian Cross's name was explicitly mentioned as someone suited to support those responsibilities. I stopped there for longer than I should have, feeling the shape of the trap. I looked up at Margaret and asked whether this was the version that would be officially presented. She nodded and said yes, this was exactly the document Sienna was relying on to claim her position. I leaned back and let the meaning of that settle. In that moment, I finally understood why they were acting the way they were. If this was all there was, then yes, it would look as though everything had already been decided before my father died, and that I truly had no standing left in the structure. But what stopped me was not the content itself. It was Margaret's face. She was watching me too carefully, not with sympathy, not with concern, with patience, as though she was waiting for me to notice what was missing. So I looked back down at the will and read it again, this time with a different eye. I noticed something then, not in a single line, but in the overall construction. It was too neat, too direct, too polished. It had none of the layered ambiguity my father usually built into important decisions. He had always left room for second meanings, for a deeper logic only visible to someone willing to look hard enough. I raised my eyes to Margaret again, and without her saying a word, I understood. This will was not the whole story, and the very perfection of it was what made me begin to suspect it was only the first layer of something far more complex. I lowered the will to the table slowly, already sensing that I had just seen a major part of the story, but not the deepest part. Margaret stayed quiet for a few seconds, as though she wanted me to sit with my own thoughts before she took me any further. I looked at her, not with another direct question this time, but with expectation, because I knew she would not let me walk away with the truth still unfinished. Finally, she exhaled softly, opened the drawer beside her, and pulled out another file, thinner than the first one, but sealed with far more care. She placed it in front of me, but did not immediately slide it across the table, as if opening it had to be my decision. I touched the edge of the paper and hesitated, not out of fear, but because I knew that once I opened it, I would not be able to step back into the person I had been before. The moment I unfolded the first page, I saw at once that this was not a routine appendix. It was something else entirely. Margaret began to explain, her tone calm and unhurried, that my father had created a separate trust structure entirely distinct from the public will Sienna believed gave her control. I read every line, and with every line, the design became clearer. This trust was not simply about distributing assets, it was the real skeleton of power behind the company. My name was in it, not as the visible heir, but as the ultimate authorized party, the one with the right to activate the entire framework if certain conditions were met. I stopped reading and looked up at Margaret, and for the first time since entering her office, I felt something close to certainty. She gave a small nod, confirming that I had understood correctly. I turned back to the file and read the activation clauses more carefully, and my heartbeat changed the moment I fully grasped them. My father had not left this vague. He had written it with precision. The trust could be activated if there was evidence of financial misconduct, abuse of authority, or any indication that the public beneficiary named in the will was not acting in the company's best interest. I thought immediately of the offshore accounts, the questionable signatures, the transfers Adrian had approved, and suddenly everything connected in a way that felt almost too exact to be coincidence. This was not random. This was a trap designed years earlier, and I had stepped into it at exactly the moment it was meant to work. Margaret kept talking, explaining that only a very small number of people had ever known this trust existed, and that its disclosure or activation depended entirely on the discretion of the person named in that role. I looked down at my own name again and felt the full weight of what that meant. While Sienna believed she had already secured the company, she had never even touched the core of the structure that actually controlled it. I asked myself when my father had started seeing all of this, and what had convinced him he would need something this elaborate. But that question gave way to something more immediate. I was no longer the one being pushed out of the game. I was the one holding the key to a system neither of them even knew existed. I closed the file, placed it on the table, and for the first time since everything began, I felt myself breathing in a way that actually belonged to me. Not because things were okay, but because now I understood the rules of the board they were standing on. And I understood something else too. I did not need to react yet. I had time. I had proof. And I had an advantage they did not even know was there. I left Margaret's office with the file hidden carefully in my bag, but what I was really carrying with me was not paper. It was an entirely different way of seeing everything that had been unfolding around me. On the drive home, I kept thinking about the trust provisions, especially the section tying legal responsibility to financial decisions. When I laid that against the data I had already collected, everything began to fit with almost terrifying precision. Adrian's signatures on those transactions were no longer just signs of involvement. They were proof that he had placed himself exactly where my father had expected someone reckless enough to step. The moment I got home, I opened my laptop again and spread everything out. Financial reports, offshore transfers, internal approvals, the trust itself. I no longer saw them as separate fragments. I saw the machinery. Adrian had not merely participated in those financial moves. He had become the primary legal point of exposure if any part of the scheme was ever examined. What stopped me again was not just what he had done, but how perfectly the structure around him had been designed. My father had not only anticipated misconduct, he had built a system that would let it expose itself. I thought about what Margaret had said regarding activation, and for the first time I grasped the true purpose of what he had done. He had not only wanted to protect the company, he had wanted to test character. Sienna could believe she was in control, but she had never touched the center of the real power. Adrian, meanwhile, had signed every decision he thought would move him closer to that power, never realizing that each signature only bound him more tightly to responsibility. I leaned back and looked at the entire pattern I had laid out. The two of them were no longer people directing events. They were moving inside a structure my father had built long before they ever knew it existed. What stunned me most was not the complexity of the plan, but the patience behind it. He had not fought them openly. He had not confronted them. He had simply let the truth of who they were reveal itself at exactly the right time. I closed the laptop, stood up, and looked out the window at the city glowing beyond the glass. Everything outside still looked the same. But to me, everything had changed. I understood that I did not need to rush toward confrontation or try to force a conclusion. Their own actions would take them where they were already headed. And when they arrived there, I would not be the one scrambling to respond. I would be the one making the final decision. I did not move immediately after understanding the full scope of what my father had left behind, even though part of me wanted to bring everything crashing down at once. Instead, I made a choice I rarely had in the past. I waited. I went back to the company the next day, not as an executive, not as an heir, but almost like a quiet observer watching the board from the edge. No one stopped me, but no one exactly welcomed me either, and that made it easier to move unnoticed. I walked through departments, listened to fragments of conversation, watched the tension beneath the surface that Sienna and Adrian had brought into the place. Everything looked smooth if you only glanced at it. But underneath, the strain was visible to anyone paying close attention. I did not intervene. I did not ask direct questions. I simply observed, as if collecting the final pieces before the picture locked into place. I watched Adrian sit in on major decisions, signing off on high-risk transactions with a confidence he had never possessed before. Every time he did it, I thought of the trust provisions he had never seen. I watched Sienna move through meetings with the posture of a woman who believed she had already won, and the way she spoke to senior leadership made it obvious that she had given herself that victory in her own mind long ago. I stood outside those conference rooms and watched through the glass, and what I felt was no longer loss. It was distance, the kind of distance that lets you finally see clearly. At night, I reviewed everything again, cross-checking new activity against what I had already learned, and the pattern only became clearer. Adrian kept signing. Sienna kept pushing. Both of them believed they were moving toward full control. I did not stop them, because I understood something they did not. Every step they took brought them closer to the trigger my father had built into the system. In the quietest moments, sitting alone with the documents spread out in front of me, I realized that patience was not weakness. It was discipline. I was letting them climb higher, not because I lacked the power to pull them down, but because when they fell, I wanted them to have nothing left to hold on to. And for the first time since this began, I no longer felt like someone reacting to events. I felt like someone shaping the ending. The formal announcement came 3 days later in the largest conference room at headquarters, the very room that had once held the most important decisions under my father's leadership. I arrived earlier than most and took a seat near the back, close enough to see everything clearly, but far enough away not to draw immediate attention. The room gradually filled with shareholders, board members, and a few media representatives, all carrying the same question into the space. Who would take over the Hale empire now that Leonard Hale was gone? I sat quietly, listening to the low conversations around me, and I realized that most of them had already heard the same story. Sienna would assume control. Adrian would become the operational lead. No one mentioned me. It was as if I had already been removed from the narrative. When Sienna entered, the room nearly pivoted toward her on instinct. She wore a dark tailored suit, walked with measured confidence, and scanned the room like someone confirming ownership. Adrian walked beside her, holding just enough distance to appear professional, but not enough to hide that they were standing on the same side. I watched the way they greeted people, the handshakes, the practiced smiles, the polished rhythm of it all, and it was obvious they had rehearsed for this. There was no hesitation in either of them, no visible pressure, only confidence built on the belief that they had already secured the outcome. Margaret appeared at the front beside the lectern, holding the same file as before, and her presence gave the whole room a strange steadiness. When the meeting began, all attention fixed on Sienna. She stepped forward, placed a hand on the podium, and began speaking about my father's legacy, about continuity, about vision, about responsibility. I listened, not because I intended to challenge her immediately, but because I wanted to hear the shape of the story she was telling everyone. Adrian stood one step behind, nodding at the right moments, adding brief confirmations when necessary, as if they had rehearsed that choreography too. I stayed where I was and took in every detail, the lights on their faces, the reactions in the room, the confidence in Sienna's posture, and I understood that they truly believed what they were doing was already settled. No one in that room knew there was a second layer beneath everything they were watching. No one understood that what they were seeing was only the visible surface of a structure my father had built years earlier. And when I finally rose from my seat and started walking forward just after Sienna finished speaking, I knew the moment that would change everything had arrived. Sienna did not stop after her formal remarks. She moved straight into the part she had clearly been waiting for all along. Her eyes came down to where I stood, and for the first time since entering the room, our gazes met under the full attention of everyone present. She gave me a slight smile, polished enough to pass for civility, but sharp enough for me to know exactly what was behind it. She said that before moving into the next phase, she wanted to clear up certain assumptions so there would be no misunderstanding. The way she emphasized each word made the room even quieter. Adrian stepped up beside her, still silent, but his presence worked like punctuation. Sienna spoke about leadership restructuring, about the need for unity, and then she named me directly. She said I had chosen my own separate path years ago, and that choice deserved respect, but it also meant I no longer had a role in the current operations of the company. I listened to every word, not because I was surprised, but because of how perfectly she had framed it. She was not technically lying. She was simply leaving out everything that mattered. Adrian picked up the thread and added that the company needed stability in a fragile moment like this, and that maintaining the direction my father had already established was essential. I looked around the room and saw a few small nods, a few curious glances, and several people avoiding my eyes altogether. No one objected, and that silence gave their version of the story even more weight. Sienna ended by saying everything had been prepared according to plan, and that today was merely the final step in formalizing what had already been decided. I stayed still and let the words settle in the room before doing anything. And when she looked at me again, clearly waiting for a response she thought she could control, I understood that this was not the end of my place in the story. It was the beginning of the part they had never seen coming. I did not answer right away after Sienna finished. Instead, I let the silence sit for a few more seconds, long enough for every pair of eyes in the room to shift from her to me. Then I stepped forward, slowly and deliberately, not rushing, not wavering, because this moment did not need drama. It needed precision. When I reached the front, I looked past Sienna and Adrian once, not because I needed anything from them, but because I wanted to see whether they still believed they were in control. Then I turned to Margaret and gave her the smallest nod, the signal we had already agreed upon, and I asked for permission to present several materials related to the company's recent financial activity. The room stirred immediately, not because of what I had said, but because I had stepped into the discussion in a way no one had expected. Margaret did not object. She signaled to the technical staff, the screen behind us lit up, and I connected my drive to the system. The first slide appeared, and I heard the murmur spread through the room. The numbers on the screen did not match the neat version of reality that had been implied moments earlier. I did not explain immediately. I let people look, let them absorb the discrepancy. Then I began walking them through it piece by piece. I pointed to specific transfers, showed how the money had been split across intermediary accounts, and how those flows ultimately converged into offshore channels. I did not need to overstate anything. The people in that room were experienced enough to understand what they were seeing. When I moved to the next slide and the account names appeared, the atmosphere shifted from curiosity to strain. Adrian moved as though he meant to interrupt, but stopped as soon as he realized every eye in the room was now on the screen. I kept going, my voice steady and clear, showing the approval records attached to the transactions, the signatures, the timestamps, the sequence. Adrian's name appeared on the screen again and again, and I did not need to look at him to know his posture had changed. I paused only long enough for the room to absorb what was already obvious. Then I explained that this was not speculation. Every file had been pulled from internal systems and cross-verified with independent sources. I was not asking them to believe me. I was asking them to read what was right in front of them. When I turned back towards Sienna, I saw something I had not seen in her face until then, a small break in certainty. I ended that section simply, saying that what I had shown so far was only the beginning of what I had discovered, and that I trusted the board would want to review everything carefully before taking any irreversible action. And in that moment, I knew the balance in the room had begun to shift. I did not need to say much after the data appeared on the screen, because the silence in the room had already started speaking for me. I stepped back and let Margaret move forward. One short glance passed between us, and she understood it was time for the rest to be brought into the open. She opened the file in her hands, and though her tone remained calm, it carried a very different kind of weight now. She explained that beyond the public will that had already been circulated, my father had established a separate legal structure to ensure that the true control of the company could not be misused. I watched the faces around the room. Surprise moved visibly through them. Sienna stayed still, trying to hold on to composure, but there was tension in her expression now. Adrian looked at Margaret with the unmistakable face of someone who had just realized he was hearing a script he had never been given. Margaret went on. She explained that the structure would only activate if there was evidence of financial misconduct, abuse of power, or decision-making contrary to the company's interests, and that the evidence just presented met those activation conditions in full. I listened, not because I still needed clarification, but because I wanted to feel the shape of the room change. When Margaret reached the part concerning the transfer of control, I realized the atmosphere had been completely transformed. My name was read aloud as the designated final authority, the person granted the power to activate the trust and assume full control over the company's governance in the event of such violations. I did not step forward to confirm anything. I did not have to. The documents in front of everyone had already done that. Adrian tried to speak. He attempted to challenge the interpretation, but the certainty had drained from his voice, and each point he tried to make was undercut by the evidence he could not deny. Sienna looked at him, and for the first time I saw real instability pass through her expression. The confidence she had worn all morning was beginning to crack. Margaret finished by stating clearly that all next steps would proceed under the trust's legal authority, and that anyone implicated in the financial misconduct would be subject to further review and legal consequence. I stood there without needing to project triumph or rage. I simply watched as everything they had built began falling apart in the exact order my father had anticipated. And in that moment, I understood with total clarity that real power is never about who speaks the loudest. It is about who holds the truth at the moment it matters most. The room lost its polished order almost immediately after Margaret finished speaking, and I could feel the disruption spreading row by row. Quiet exchanges became louder ones. Board members turned to one another, reviewing documents and checking sections for themselves, while several people were already on their phones. I stayed where I was and watched the entire scene as though I were slightly outside it, even though I knew I was now at its center. Sienna reacted first. She stepped forward and demanded clarification, her voice pitched higher than normal, but the certainty she had carried earlier was gone. She looked at Margaret, then at me, searching for something to stabilize herself against. Adrian said very little, but I could see the shift in him too. His shoulders tightened. His eyes moved between the screen and the people around him, calculating, reassessing. Then one of the board's legal representatives stood and proposed an immediate pause in proceedings to evaluate the evidence and legal implications, and in that moment I knew the situation had gone far beyond their reach. Several people approached Adrian, not to support him, but to question him, and the short, uncertain answers he offered only made the room more suspicious. Sienna took a small step back. For the first time, I saw her genuinely disoriented, not because she had lost an argument, but because the framework she thought she stood on had vanished beneath her feet. I did not move toward either of them. I did not say anything else. There was no need. Things were already unfolding at the pace they needed to. And when two security officers appeared at the doorway, followed closely by members of internal audit, I understood that the next phase had already begun. Adrian was asked to remain for further review, and although he tried to stay composed, I could see his hand clench involuntarily. Sienna stood a few feet away, watching it happen, unable to intervene. In that moment, I knew they had not only lost power, they had lost the ability to control the story itself. I turned and walked out of the room while voices still rose behind me, and for the first time since everything began, I did not feel any need to look back. The days after the announcement were not loud in the way people imagine collapse. They were slow, structured, and filled with decisions that required clarity more than emotion. I returned to the office in a role I had once chosen to leave behind, but everything about it felt different now. There was no longer the weight of my father's expectations hanging over me, and no need to prove anything. There was only responsibility, the responsibility of dealing with what had been neglected, hidden, and mishandled for far too long. The first time I walked into my father's office after his death, I opened the door slowly and stood there for a few seconds before stepping inside, as if I needed to accept that this room now belonged to me in a way it never had before. Everything was still exactly where he had left it. The arrangement of the files, the pen lying neatly on the desk, the silence of a room that still felt inhabited by him somehow. I did not sit immediately. I walked around, touched the familiar surfaces, and let myself remember the rhythm he had once kept there. When I finally sat in his chair, I opened the newest reports and began with the most urgent financial matters. The numbers were no longer abstract figures on a screen. They were the direct consequences of choices I now understood in full. I worked closely with the audit team, traced the damage, identified where the risks sat, what had to be contained first, and what could be repaired only slowly. Not everything could be fixed at once, but being able to see the shape of the problem gave me the control I needed. In my first meetings with the board, I noticed a difference in how they looked at me. There was no longer hesitation in the room. There was caution, yes, and expectation, but not dismissal. I did not try to impress anyone. I simply made decisions clearly and based them on what the facts required. And yet, even in the middle of all that work, there were moments when I stopped and thought about everything that had happened and understood that betrayal does not disappear just because you regain your position. It remains there as part of the ground you now stand on. I did not try to forget it. I did not try to turn it into motivation. I simply accepted that it existed. And at the end of each day, when I looked out through the office windows at the city lights beginning to glow, I understood that this story was not over. It had only shifted into another stage, one where I was no longer reacting to what others were doing. I was choosing what came next. What happened to Adrian and Sienna did not happen in a single dramatic blow. It came the way consequences often do, slowly, step by step, each one clear and irreversible. I was not directly involved in every legal process, but I stayed informed, and each update only confirmed what I had already seen. Adrian was called in repeatedly. His accounts were frozen. Every signature he had placed so confidently on those approvals became evidence attached to his name. I was told he tried to explain that he had only been following strategic guidance, but systems like that do not let responsibility float away so easily. Sienna did not face the exact same legal exposure Adrian did, but that did not mean she escaped consequence. Her reputation took the first blow. Once the story began circulating beyond the company, people who had once aligned themselves with her started keeping their distance. I saw her name appear in headlines I am certain she had never imagined being attached to, and the way people spoke of her shifted almost overnight. She was no longer the poised successor. She was part of a scandal. As for my family, at least in the sense I had once understood it, that family no longer existed. There were no check-in calls, no attempts at gathering, just absence, a wide quiet where blood ties had once been. I did not reach out to them, and they did not try to reach out to me. What occupied my mind most was not what they were losing, but how they had brought themselves to exactly that place. I kept thinking back to those hospital hallways, to the glances, to the decisions they had made. None of it had happened suddenly. It had all been the result of a sequence of choices, each one leading a little further toward an outcome they never fully imagined. I did not take pleasure in watching it happen. I did not feel compelled to forgive it either. I simply recognized it as the inevitable arc of the story they had written for themselves. And while they faced the consequences of what they had done, I kept moving forward, not to erase the past, but to ensure it no longer defined me. One late evening, when most of the office had emptied out, I opened the bottom drawer of my father's desk, the one I had not touched until then. There was not much inside. Just a few neatly ordered documents and a single slim envelope set apart from the rest, as if it had been left there with a very specific purpose. I picked it up and felt how light it was, then sat down before opening it, because I already sensed that what was inside would not just be information. It might be the explanation I had been searching for all along. The letter was handwritten, in the same familiar script I had seen my entire life. This time, though, I read much more slowly, paying attention to every sentence. He did not mention Sienna or Adrian directly, but the way he wrote about trust, about what power reveals in people, made me understand that he had seen more than he had ever chosen to say. He wrote that some things cannot be protected by holding them too tightly, and that sometimes the only way to know who is worthy of carrying something forward is to let character reveal itself. I stopped reading there for a long time because that paragraph explained more than any direct confession could have. It explained his silence, the trust, the distance he had sometimes placed between us. He wrote of me too, not as the obvious heir, but as the one who needed to learn how to see clearly without being driven by status or expectation. In that moment, I understood that letting me leave the company years ago had never been rejection. It had been part of preparing me. When I folded the letter and placed it back in the drawer, I no longer felt the need to keep asking what he had meant. What I had once mistaken for distance was, in fact, the way he had protected me from what was already taking shape. I sat in that office for a while after that, doing nothing, letting everything settle, and for the first time since he died, I no longer felt like I was trying to understand my father. I felt like I was finally beginning to understand myself inside the story he had built in silence.
I'm Sophia, and if you've stayed with Vivian Hale's story all the way to the end, then you probably understand that this was never just a story about infidelity or about people fighting over money. It was about what power does to people, and about how small choices, repeated often enough, become a fate no one can reverse. The part that stays with me most is not the twist at the end. It is the way the ending was built from the very beginning, through avoided eye contact, half-truths, and choices that each person convinced themselves were not that serious yet. Sienna did not become that person overnight. Her resentment had been gathering for years, fed by comparison, by feeling second, by growing up in someone else's shadow. And when the opportunity came, she did not stop to ask whether what she wanted was right. She only thought, finally, this is my chance to step out of that shadow. And that belief was what made her blind to the cost. Adrian was not all that different. He did not begin as a destroyer. He began as an ambitious man, someone who wanted more and wanted it faster. But the real danger of ambition is not wanting to go further. It is what you are willing to trade away in order to get there. When enough small decisions are made in favor of immediate gain, a person eventually stops noticing when they cross the line. By the time they do, everything is already documented. Every signature, every approval, every choice, and there is no easy path back. And Vivian, to me, is what makes the whole story meaningful. What made her different was not that she was stronger from the very start, or smarter than everyone else in every moment. She was hurt. She was blindsided. She stood in a situation where almost anyone could have responded emotionally and burned everything down on instinct. But she chose not to. She observed. She waited. And more than anything, she refused to let emotion make her blind. That is not weakness. That is discipline, especially when you are the one who has been betrayed. So what is the lesson here? First, not everyone who betrays you wins, at least not for long. Some victories exist only in the moment. The consequences arrive later. So do not measure your life against someone else's appearance of control. You never know what they are really building underneath it. Second, the truth does not need to rush. We live in a time when everyone wants immediate reaction, instant judgment, instant closure. But sometimes the strongest move is to slow down, see clearly, and wait. You do not always need to prove that you are right the second you discover something. Sometimes silence and observation are the most powerful forms of self-protection. Third, be careful with small choices. No one wakes up one morning and steps directly into a great betrayal. Those things are built from little compromises, one after another. One principle ignored, one excuse made, one line crossed and justified, and then one day you no longer recognize where your limits were supposed to be. And finally, there is one thing this story makes very clear. Real power is not about how much you hold. It is about how deeply you understand what you are holding. Vivian did not win because she got the company back. She won because she understood how things worked, because she saw the people around her clearly, and because in the end, she understood herself. If you have ever felt pushed to the edge of the board, dismissed, underestimated, or unfairly written out of a story that should have included you, remember this. Your position in the moment is not the final verdict on your life. Sometimes standing back is not the same as losing. Sometimes it is exactly what allows you to take the next right step. If this story made you think, leave a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I always want to know how far this community reaches. And if you want more stories like this, stories that are not just entertaining but also help you look at life and at yourself more clearly, don't forget to like and subscribe. There are many more stories ahead of us.